By October 1944, the Pacific War had shifted decisively toward the Philippine archipelago. For the United States, the return to the Philippines served twin purposes: to fulfill a publicly stated commitment by Allied leadership to restore Commonwealth authority on Luzon, and to cut Japan's principal sea lanes linking the southern resource areas, Borneo, Sumatra, and the Netherlands East Indies, to the home islands. For Japan, retaining the Philippines meant preserving the final maritime corridor for crude oil, refined fuel, and strategic materials, without which fleet operations would contract further. The archipelago's central position and strait system, San Bernardino, Surigao, and Mindoro, focused both coalitions on a limited set of passages whose control would decide whether maritime traffic moved or halted. The preceding campaign in the Marianas had stripped the Imperial Navy of carrier air groups and forward bases. Between June and July 1944, U.S. forces seized Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, placing B-29 bases within range of Japan and drawing the combined fleet into air and sea battles that costed hundreds of aircraft and many trained aircrew. The loss of carrier air strength forced Japanese planners to reconsider how to employ capital ships, whose main protection had been organic air coverage. By early autumn 1944, the Imperial Navy possessed powerful surface formations, centered on fast battleships and heavy cruisers, but lacked an air arm capable of sustained fleet defense. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, U.S. planning synchronized two fleets for the Philippines. Admiral William F. Halsey's Third Fleet, built around Task Force 38's fast carriers and fast battleships, would strike airfields and shipping, screen the eastern approaches, and seek decisive fleet action. Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid's Seventh Fleet, with escort carriers, older battleships, and extensive amphibious assets, would deliver and support General Walter Kruger's Sixth Army for the Leyte landings. The amphibious phase began on October 20th, 1944, with beachheads established on Leyte's eastern shore near Tacloban and Dulag. Seventh Fleet's escort carrier groups, designated Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3 under Rear Admirals Thomas Sprague and Clifton A.F. Sprague, provided close air support, anti-submarine patrols, and air cover over the beaches while Third Fleet ranged farther out to suppress distant airfields and search for major enemy units. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff and Combined Fleet adopted Operation Shogo 1, a multi-axis plan to attack U.S. invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf. The concept reflected Japan's remaining strengths and constraints: strong surface gunnery forces, limited fuel stocks, and a depleted carrier air arm. The plan divided available forces into four principal groups: Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force at Brunei, battleships Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, Kongo, Haruna, multiple heavy cruisers including Atago, Takao, Maya, Chokai, Tone, Chikuma, Suzuya, Kumano, Haguro, Myoko, light cruisers and destroyers would pass through the Sibuyan Sea and emerge via the San Bernardino Strait to fall on U.S. transports from the north. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's Southern Force, older battleships Fuso and Yamashiro with cruisers and destroyers, would advance through Surigao Strait to attack from the south, later joined separately by Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima's group. To the north, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's Decoy Northern Force, carriers with few aircraft supported by cruisers and destroyers, would draw Halsey away from the San Bernardino approach. The intent was to disperse U.S. striking power, then concentrate Japanese heavy guns against lightly protected shipping inside Leyte Gulf. Shogo, one assumed several conditions: that land-based air from Luzon and the Visayas could contest U.S. air superiority, that the Northern Forces carriers, even with limited air groups, would compel Third Fleet to move north, and that Center and Southern Forces could survive passage through narrow waters under submarine and air attack. Fuel scarcity imposed strict speed and route choices. Japanese tankers had suffered losses on approaches to the South China Sea, and deliveries from Borneo refineries faced submarine interdiction and aerial mining. As a result, Combined Fleet's operational tempo and training hours were restricted, affecting gunnery practice, night fighting drills, and anti-air coordination. U.S. intelligence assessed major Japanese surface units still afloat, but did not possess certainty about their timing or axes of advance. Radio intelligence tracked movements from Linga and Brunei toward the Philippines, while submarine patrols intensified on probable approaches. On 23 October 1944, U.S. submarines Darter and Dace intercepted Kurita's center force in the Palawan Passage, torpedoing and sinking Atago and Maya and damaging Takao, which retired. These losses reduced heavy cruiser numbers before the main approach. Nevertheless, the core battleship strength remained intact. For U.S. commanders, the contact confirmed that a large surface force sought to reach Leyte. For Japanese commanders, the incident revealed submarine threat density along predictable tracks, but did not alter the imperative to press the plan. Public sentiment and political aims framed the operation on both sides. In the United States, the Philippine campaign was presented as a step toward isolating Japan and liberating Allied territory, with the added operational value of airfields and anchorages to support subsequent moves toward Luzon or Formosa. In Japan, official communications emphasized decisive counteraction to reverse losses and protect southern resources, while acknowledging in internal memoranda the attrition of trained aviators and the fuel situation. Civilians in the central Philippines faced air raids, naval bombardments on outlying positions, and the disruption of inter-island shipping as both sides concentrated forces. Evacuation measures and requisitioning affected local economies, while collaborationist and guerrilla networks sought advantage or survival amid shifting control. Doctrinal perspectives shaped expectations for the coming engagements. U.S. carrier doctrine emphasized massed, centrally directed air power for sea control, with escort carriers assigned to sea lane protection and amphibious support rather than fleet battle. U.S. surface battleship doctrine had evolved toward radar-directed night actions, but was secondary to carrier strike operations. Japanese surface doctrine retained confidence in long-range gunnery and torpedo attack, now to be applied in daylight under hostile air superiority, and relied on coordinated night approaches through straits. The mismatch between doctrine and available air cover would play directly into the events east of Samar. By the evening of October 24th, after heavy U.S. carrier strikes in the Sibuyan Sea that sank Musashi and forced a temporary withdrawal, Kurita reversed course again toward San Bernardino Strait. Halsey's fast carriers moved north after detecting Ozawa's decoy force. 7th Fleet's escort carriers and their destroyer-destroyer escort screens continued close support of ground operations, with Taffy, 3 assigned to the northernmost station off Samar. The operational geometry, center force to the west of Samar, the strait unguarded by fast battleships, and escort carriers conducting routine support, set the preconditions for the encounter that would follow at dawn on the 25th of October. At dawn on the 25th of October, 1944, the waters east of Samar lay under scattered clouds with moderate seas and a light wind from the northeast. Escort Carrier Task Unit 77.4.3, Taffy 3, operated on its morning flight routine, roughly 60 kilometers east of Samar Island. Its composition reflected the hybrid character of the 7th Fleet's escort carrier groups, 6 Casablanca and 1 Sangamon-class carriers, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitcoon Bay, and Gambier Bay, screened by 3 destroyers, Howell, Heerman, and Johnston, and 4 destroyer escorts, Dennis, Raymond, John C. Butler, and Samuel B. Roberts. Each carrier launched composite air squadrons combining FM-2 Wildcat fighters and TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, tasked mainly with anti-submarine patrols, reconnaissance, and close support for ground troops on Leyte. These vessels were lightly armored, with flight decks of unarmored steel and maximum speeds near 19 knots, sufficient for transport and coastal air cover, but never intended for fleet combat. At approximately 06:45 local time, lookouts aboard Taffy 3's carriers sighted shell splashes on the northern horizon. What first appeared to be a distant squall soon revealed the glint of gunfire and the silhouettes of heavy ships. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, having transited the San Bernardino Strait during the night without opposition, emerged into the open sea west of Samar with 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, led with Musashi's surviving sister, supported by Kongo and Haruna. Cruiser divisions under Vice Admirals Nishimura and Ozawa were gone. The center force now represented the concentrated surface might of the Imperial Navy, unaware that its northern decoy had succeeded in drawing away Halsey's Third Fleet. Kurita expected to encounter major U.S. carrier groups or transports. Instead, he confronted escort carriers and their minimal screen. Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, immediately ordered evasive maneuvers. Smoke generators were activated, and the carriers turned east into the wind to launch every available aircraft. Pilots received hurried instructions. Attack at once, regardless of ordnance type. Some Avengers carried depth charges instead of torpedoes. Others had half-loaded bomb racks for ground strikes. The initial takeoffs placed dozens of aircraft into the air within minutes, climbing above low clouds to locate and harass the approaching Japanese columns. Meanwhile, Sprague signaled for assistance from Taffy, 2 and 1, and from 7th Fleet headquarters. The destroyers and destroyer escorts turned toward the enemy to lay smoke and make torpedo runs. From Yamato's bridge, Kurita's staff observed multiple small carriers fleeing eastward, misidentifying them as fast carriers from Halsey's fleet. The order to pursue was immediate. Heavy cruisers Chokai, Chikuma, and Tone opened fire at ranges of over 30 kilometers. Shells from 8-inch and 18.1-inch batteries landed near the retreating American ships, throwing up towering geysers. Despite superior firepower, Japanese gunnery suffered from range miscalculations, smoke interference, and overcast light. Within the first 15 minutes, Howell, Johnston, and Heerman began aggressive counterattacks. Commander Ernest Evans aboard Johnston advanced through the smoke at high speed, firing 5-inch guns and launching a full salvo of 10 torpedoes at the lead heavy cruisers. One torpedo struck Kumano near the bow, forcing her to slow and withdraw. Howell's attack drew concentrated fire that eventually disabled her steering, but the delay forced Japanese cruisers to alter course. Above, American aircraft formed improvised strike groups. Lacking armor-piercing bombs, they aimed for bridge structures, exposed anti-aircraft positions, and near-miss water bursts to disrupt formation. Several Avengers made low-level torpedo drops at extreme range, while Wildcats strafed decks to suppress gunners. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was intense but uneven, and repeated diving and reforming attacks kept the column under constant pressure. Pilots radioed the positions of battleships and cruisers, transmitting sightings to other task units. Kurita's bridge officers struggled to identify targets amid rain squalls and dense smoke screens that distorted radar readings and visual signals. Between 0720 and 0830, multiple Japanese ships sustained damage. Chokai was hit by bombs and later crippled by near misses that ruptured fuel lines. Chikuma took torpedo hits from aircraft of White Plains and Kitkun Bay, losing speed and later abandoned. Haruna and Kongo received minor bomb damage. The concentrated destroyer counterattacks and the confusion of torpedo wakes forced Kurita's formation into disarray. For the first time, the Japanese admiral questioned whether he faced light units or an ambush covering major carriers beyond the horizon. Communications between ships deteriorated as flag signals vanished into smoke and radio coordination remained restricted to avoid enemy direction finding. On the American side, Taffy 3 endured relentless shell fire. Gambier Bay, struck repeatedly by 8-inch shells from Chikuma, slowed and stopped at 0907, then capsized under continued attack. St. Lo and White Plains sustained near misses that riddled flight decks and ruptured fuel lines. Kalinin Bay was hit by several shells, but continued launching aircraft. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, after a high-speed torpedo run that damaged Chokai, was hit and eventually sank. Howell and Johnston, both under heavy fire, were lost with large portions of their crews. Despite these losses, the combined effect of smoke, aircraft harassment, and torpedo threats distorted Kurita's picture of the battlefield. At 0920, Kurita, unsure of his exact position and convinced he faced superior carrier groups, ordered a general withdrawal to the northwest. The decision ended direct pursuit and spared the surviving carriers of Taffy 3 from annihilation. Yet the engagement had inflicted disproportionate results. Multiple Japanese cruisers sunk or disabled, dozens of aircraft destroyed, and morale shaken among surviving crews. American forces, though battered, had prevented a service breakthrough into Leyte Gulf. In Tokyo, the news of the encounter arrived fragmented. Initial reports claimed heavy enemy losses, then later acknowledged withdrawal. For the Imperial Navy, the engagement off Samar represented both a tactical confusion and a strategic failure. The decisive fleet action intended to disrupt the Leyte landings had not materialized as planned. In the U.S. 7th Fleet's log, the event was catalogued as a defensive action by escort units, yet its consequences extended beyond immediate survival. It marked the final appearance of Japanese battleships in offensive surface combat and demonstrated the vulnerability of unprotected air support formations that, through improvisation and determination, altered the course of an entire operation. The battle off Samar was one segment of a much larger operation that unfolded across the central Philippines from 23rd to 26th October 1944, collectively known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. While the clash east of Samar had ended in Kurita's retreat, the broader operational framework of Shogo, one continued to unravel on multiple fronts. To the south, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's Southern Force had already met disaster in the early hours of the 25th of October while attempting to transit Surigao Strait. There, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's U.S. covering forces, comprising 6 pre-war battleships, 8 cruisers, and 28 destroyers, formed a classic line-ahead ambush using radar-directed fire control. In minutes, Fuzo and Yamashiro were shattered by torpedoes and 14 and 16-inch shells, while accompanying cruisers and destroyers were lost or scattered. Nishimura was killed with most of his staff, and the southern pincer of Shogo, one ceased to exist. Kurita's center force, unaware of the southern defeat, pressed on alone toward Samar, while to the north, Admiral Ozawa's northern force executed its sacrificial role against Halsey's pursuing carriers. Ozawa's decoy group, carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chaitos, and Chiyoda, with accompanying cruisers and destroyers, had departed northern waters with barely 100 aircraft among them. Their task was not to win an air battle, but to attract the attention of the U.S. 3rd Fleet and its powerful Task Force 38. On October 24th, when Halsey received reports of Japanese carriers north of Luzon, he interpreted them as a major threat. Believing Kurita's center force had been neutralized after Musashi's loss in the Sibuyan Sea, Halsey turned his entire striking strength northward, leaving the San Bernardino Strait uncovered. This decision, one of the most debated of the Pacific War, exposed 7th Fleet's flank and allowed Kurita's night passage towards Samar. On the 25th of October, while Taffy 3 fought for survival, Halsey's air group struck Ozawa's northern force off Cape Engano. Carrier air groups from Essex, Lexington, Intrepid, and others launched successive waves of bombers and fighters that devastated the Japanese carriers. Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force, sank with nearly 800 men. Zuiho, Chitos, and Chiyoda followed, along with several cruisers and destroyers. By sunset, the northern force had ceased to function as an organized unit. The decoy mission had succeeded tactically, but failed strategically. It had drawn Halsey away at precisely the moment when his presence might have prevented the crisis off Samar. Meanwhile, in the Sibuyan Sea and along the approaches to Leyte, air and submarine actions continued to shape the battle's outcome. U.S. submarines had already crippled Kurita's strength tons before he reached the Philippine coast. Now, carrier aviation and land-based aircraft from Tacloban and Mindoro intensified their strikes on withdrawing Japanese units. Cruisers crippled off Samar were hunted down. Chikuma sank after sustained air attack. Chokai, hit earlier by shellfire and aircraft, was scuttled by her crew. Damage to heavy cruisers, Suzuya and Kumano further reduced the center force's offensive potential. Though Yamato and Nagato emerged with comparatively minor damage, The loss of escorting cruisers and the exhaustion of ammunition curtailed any further offensive intent. The cumulative effects of the four engagements, Sibuyan Sea, Surigao Strait, Cape Engano, and Samar, signaled the end of Japan's ability to wage coordinated fleet operations. The Imperial Navy lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 12 destroyers, along with over 10,000 sailors. American losses were comparatively lighter. 1 light carrier, St. Lo, later sunk by the first successful kamikaze strike. 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort, with about 1,500 personnel killed. Yet beyond statistics, the battle's significance lay in what it revealed about the balance of power. Japan could still inflict damage, but no longer mount sustained offensive action. On Leyte itself, the ground campaign proceeded under new conditions. The elimination of Japanese fleet support allowed U.S. forces to expand the beachhead and move inland toward Karigara Bay. Japanese ground units, deprived of naval gunfire and resupply, began defensive withdrawals into the mountainous interior. The loss of sea control around the Visayas severed reinforcement routes from Mindanao and Luzon. For the Imperial Army, this meant that operations in the Philippines would become static and attritional, relying on shrinking stockpiles of ammunition and food. Strategically, both sides reassessed their positions in the Pacific. For the United States, Leyte Gulf validated the concept of fast carrier dominance and the integration of amphibious operations with continuous air support. The coordination between escort carriers, destroyers, and shore-based aircraft proved decisive in maintaining air cover, even when the main fleet was absent. It also demonstrated vulnerabilities, the dependence on intelligence assumptions, and the risk of separating command structures between the 3rd and 7th Fleets. Admiral Chester Nimitz, upon learning of Halsey's northern chase, famously signaled an ambiguous query: where is Task Force 34? Reflecting headquarters' uncertainty about who guarded the San Bernardino Passage. For Japan, Shogo 1 represented both strategic desperation and tactical audacity. The plan relied on perfect timing and on the enemy's predictable responses. In practice, the loss of communications, fragmented command, and fuel shortages undermined coordination. Even so, the courage and discipline of Japanese surface crews, sailing battleships through mined straits under air assault, demonstrated the Navy's enduring operational professionalism despite impossible odds. Yet, professionalism could not compensate for industrial and logistical collapse. The loss of oil access after the Philippines campaign would ground the remaining fleet and force reliance on kamikaze tactics from shore bases. As news of the battle spread, interpretations diverged. American press releases emphasized the destruction of Japan's naval power, framing the engagement as a decisive victory comparable to Midway. Japanese communications downplayed losses and highlighted temporary tactical successes, though internal memoranda admitted the fleet's effective ruin. Within the Imperial Navy staff, debates began over the future use of remaining heavy units, whether to preserve them for homeland defense or employ them in symbolic final operations. These discussions directly influenced the planning of Yamato's final sortie in April 1945, Operation 10 Go, a mission that would echo the lost ambitions of Shogo 1, but on a smaller, tragic scale. In the weeks following Leyte Gulf, salvage and rescue operations continued across the Philippine seas. Hundreds of survivors from both sides drifted for days before recovery. Filipino fishermen and coastal villagers found debris, oil slicks, and bodies washing ashore. The scale of naval losses transformed the region into a maritime graveyard, with sunken ships marking new boundaries of Allied control. For the United States Navy, Samar and Leyte Gulf provided operational lessons in coordination, communication, and the unpredictable nature of war at sea. For Japan, it marked the irreversible transition from fleet warfare to defense by suicide tactics and isolated garrisons. The battle off Samar, though part of a larger whole, became its symbolic center, the moment when courage, confusion, and the end of an empire converged upon the same horizon. The first minutes of contact east of Samar produced a sequence of actions that defined the character of the entire engagement: detection, misidentification, emergency launch procedures, and improvised attack profiles. Visual sightings by Taffy 3 watchstanders shortly after 6:40 were corroborated by splashes from long-range salvos, falling 2 to 3 cables short of the escort carriers. Radar returns were inconsistent through rain cells. Smoke generators and rain squalls repeatedly degraded surface search on both sides. Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague ordered "launch everything," a directive that converted routine anti-submarine and air support sorties into strike and harassment missions. Within minutes, Fanshawe Bay and sister carriers turned into the wind at about 19 knots, while destroyers increased speed to over 30 knots to lay smoke and interpose themselves between the carriers and the approaching columns. The geometry favored the pursuer. Kurita's battleships, Yamato with 46-centimeter guns, Nagato with 41-centimeter, Kongo and Haruna with 36-centimeter, closed at speeds exceeding 25 knots, supported by heavy cruisers with 20-centimeter batteries and long-lance torpedoes. Yet the battle space was not open ocean, but a patchwork of visibility corridors, smoke banks, low cloud at 1,500 to 2,000 meters, and intermittent squalls. Japanese spotters reported multiple carriers, estimating larger Essex-class silhouettes, when they in fact observed Casablanca-class escort carriers with single elevators and shorter flight decks. This misreading, combined with scattered radar plots, reinforced the belief that major carriers were just beyond the visible line, shaping Kurita's decision to press the chase at high speed rather than pause to form battle line for deliberate gunnery. Aircraft launched with whatever ordnance was already loaded. Avengers from Kalinin Bay and White Plains carried 500-pound general-purpose bombs, depth charges, or mixed racks. Several had no torpedoes aboard. Wildcats carried .50 caliber ammunition, and, in some flights, small demolition bombs or rockets for planned ground support over Leyte. Pilots received brief target priorities: slow the enemy, disrupt fire control, and force course changes. The first attack waves approached in singles and pairs, making low-level runs against cruisers believed to be directing long-range fire, then climbing to re-attack bridges and aft superstructures where rangefinders and directors were concentrated. On the surface, the 3 Fletcher-class destroyers pivoted from screening to strike. Johnston accelerated out of the smokes at approximately 700 to 0710, closed to within torpedo range of the lead heavy cruisers, and released a full salvo to port. Hole and Heermann followed on separate bearings, each threading through shell splashes and adjusting to salvo ladders from 20-centimeter batteries. Torpedo wakes forced multiple Japanese ships to turn away. At least one hit disabled the bow of Kumano, reducing her speed and removing a gun mount from the engagement. Even unsuccessful runs had effects. Course alterations disrupted Japanese fire control solutions and stretched the formation along divergent axes, complicating Yamato's ability to bring all forward turrets to bear simultaneously. Gunnery exchanges reflected doctrine and technology under stress. Japanese optical fire control favored stable platforms and clear lines of sight. Here, smoke and maneuver denied both. American 5-inch/38 guns used radar ranges where possible, but jamming, rain, and own smoke attenuation limited continuity. As the carriers maintained easterly courses to recover and relaunch aircraft, splashes bracketed their wakes. Gambier Bay, with a top speed around 19 knots, became the most vulnerable hull once a cruiser division found the range through a gap in the smoke. Her steering corrections to evade straddles increased drag. Near misses flooded compartments through hull seams and weakened propulsion. Despite this, she continued to turn into the wind to get aircraft off the deck until repeated hits stopped her. Overhead, the first American air attacks concentrated on heavy cruisers carrying the bulk of fire control responsibilities. Bombs set topside fires and destroyed rangefinders. Near-miss shock damaged shafts and ruptured fuel lines. Chokai suffered hits and near misses that immobilized her, while Chikuma absorbed cumulative damage from bombs and later torpedoes delivered by Avengers that had rearmed at Taffy 2's decks or diverted to airstrips on Leyte. Tone maneuvered aggressively and kept several batteries in action despite repeated harassment. Battleships, especially Yamato, proved resistant to 500-pound general-purpose bombs, but even they were compelled to weave against perceived torpedo threats, reducing the steadiness needed for long-range main battery fire. Communications discipline diverged from plan on both sides. Kurita's force limited radio to reduce enemy direction finding, with visual signaling obscured. Local captains exercised initiative that sometimes conflicted with flagship intent. The result was a series of uncoordinated pushes by cruiser groups rather than a single-timed concentration. On the American side, Taffy 3's internal nets remained crowded but functional as Sprague passed bearings to Taffy 2 and 1 and requested all-hand strikes from 7th Fleet and, if within range, 3rd Fleet. Pilots cycled through fuel-critical profiles, attack, climb into cloud, report, then divert to the nearest deck for fuel and another improvised loadout. Civilian observation and impact in the eastern Visayas were indirect but immediate. On Samar's eastern coast, villages reported continuous thunder from seaward and occasional debris rafting ashore in the days that followed. Fishing traffic halted along the eastern littoral. Coastal movement into Tacloban and Guayuan reduced as military patrols warned against unexploded ordnance and oil slicks. On Leyte, the tempo of close air support sorties dipped temporarily during the crisis, then resumed once emergency strikes were committed and refueled, slightly delaying pre-planned missions for infantry pushing inland from Dulag and Palo. Morale effects were asymmetrical and shifted during the first engagements. For Taffy 3, the transition from routine support tasks to a running surface action produced initial shock. Then, a tactical rhythm built on smoke, torpedo feints, and continuous air attack. Reports of hits on cruisers circulated through voice nets, reinforcing the decision to keep closing for additional torpedo runs despite casualties. In Kurita's columns, early confidence in gunnery superiority met repeated forced course changes and the erosion of cruiser strength. Yamato's staff wrestled with target selection, whether to finish damaged escort carriers in sight or push past the skirmish screen in search of heavier ships reported by scouts but unseen through smoke and rain. By approximately 0830, the cumulative effect of destroyer torpedo attacks and air harassment created a tactical environment in which neither side exerted consistent fire control dominance. American carriers, still under fire, continued flight operations with deck crews working around holes and splinter damage. Destroyer escorts, smaller, slower, but with torpedoes and rapid-fire 5-inch guns, executed short-range dashes to protect stragglers and complete firing solutions against cruisers already slowed by earlier hits. Japanese light cruisers and destroyers attempted to set up torpedo spreads to cut off the American retreat, but smoke banks and warning calls from patrolling aircraft disrupted timing. Unexpected outcomes accumulated. Aircraft armed with depth charges achieved damaging near misses when dropped abeam of cruisers at low altitude, an unplanned use of anti-submarine ordnance against surface targets that nevertheless fractured plating and impaired steering. Destroyer and destroyer escort gun crews scored superstructure hits with proximity-fused 5-inch shells, where available, degrading rangefinder crews and communications aerials. Conversely, long-range main battery fire that should have dictated the engagement lost effectiveness whenever squalls closed in, or when evasive maneuvers forced salvo chasing rather than steady bracketing. By the end of this opening phase, the tactical picture had inverted from the one implied by orders of battle. A formation with 4 battleships and multiple heavy cruisers had not broken through to the escort carrier's wake. A screen built for anti-submarine duty had preserved flight operations long enough to keep aircraft cycling. Losses and damage were real. Gambier Bay fatally hit. Destroyers gutted by medium-caliber shells, carriers holed, yet the Japanese approach had been slowed and stretched. The practical result was time, minutes converted into additional launches, additional torpedo runs, and additional opportunities for coordination with adjacent task units. That time, gained in the first engagements by smoke, misidentification, and persistent attack, set the conditions for the subsequent crisis and the decision paths that would follow for both commands. Between 0830 and 0930 on 25th October, The encounter off Samar entered a phase defined by cumulative damage, ammunition expenditure, and command friction. The American screen had expended a portion of its torpedoes in early runs. Hull and Johnston were already suffering steering and propulsion casualties from repeated 8-inch and 6-inch hits, while Heermann still retained tubes and speed. The destroyer escorts, smaller but agile, prepared for short-range attacks to disorganize cruiser fire. On the flight decks, deck crews on Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitcoon Bay, and St. Lo worked around shrapnel cuts and cratered planking to spot aircraft. Reported launch intervals fell to minutes. Some Avengers were sent aloft with fuel only and orders to search for targets or to make dry torpedo runs to induce evasive turns. Weather and sea state acted as variables both sides could neither control nor ignore. Squalls crossed the engagement area from northeast to southwest, periodically lowering visibility to under 5,000 meters. Smoke generators on the destroyers produced banks that fused with rain curtains to create temporary concealment corridors. Japanese optical fire control lost continuity whenever these banks drifted across lines of sight. Radar aboard Yamato and Nagato provided range but required stable tracking. That maneuver denied. American 5-inch directors, where radar was serviceable, obtained quick solutions for strafing cruisers closing through gaps. But range gates opened and collapsed as ships weaved and the smoke density changed. Casualty accumulation on both sides forced redistributions of roles. Gambier Bay, slowed by flooding and repeated 8-inch hits, fell astern and became a fixed target. Chikuma and Tone closed to within 15,000 meters to finish her. Without speed, Gambier Bay could not maintain wind for sustained flight operations and capsized later in the morning. On the American right flank, Samuel B. Roberts executed a high-speed approach from behind a smoke bank, launched torpedoes at Chokai already hampered by earlier bomb damage, and fired rapid 5-inch salvos that set topside fires. Chokai lost power later and was scuttled. Heermann, engaging at close range, fired torpedoes at Haruna and Congo. Evasion orders forced both battleships to turn away briefly, reducing main battery pressure on the carriers. These short-duration actions did not remove battleships from the battle permanently, but created windows in which aircraft launched and reformed. Ammunition and fuel states introduced hard limits. Destroyers reported dwindling torpedoes and 5-inch magazines approaching lower thresholds. Several ships shifted to controlled rates of fire to conserve rounds for self-defense. On the carriers, aviation gasoline reserves fell as emergency sorties drew on unplanned cycles. Pilots diverted to Taffy to Tacloban strips when decks were fouled or fuel ran low. Japanese cruisers and battleships, after hours of high-speed transit and intermittent firing since first light, tracked main battery and secondary battery remaining rounds against uncertain target priority. Repair parties worked continuously on shattered directors and jammed turrets, but the combined effects of near misses and constant maneuvering degraded accuracy. Command and control degraded in different ways for each side. Taffy 3 maintained a single commander on scene with short voice nets and visual recognition through smoke. Sprague adjusted carrier headings and screen positions with concise orders and relied on pilot reports to update the picture westward. Kurita commanded a larger, multi-division formation that had elongated during pursuit. Flag signals vanished into smoke. Radio discipline kept tight to avoid detection earlier in the operation. Limited rapid resynchronization once divisions lost visual contact. Heavy cruiser commanders repeatedly faced choices between finishing damaged escort carriers or reforming to push past the screen toward Leyte Gulf. Each time a torpedo wake was reported or a dive-bombing attack began, captains maneuvered individually to avoid damage, widening separations and desynchronizing salvos. The crisis reached a decision point after 900. Reports on Yamato's bridge varied. Some officers believed they were engaging a protective screen for fast carriers out of sight to the east. Others argued the targets were escort carriers only. Sightings of multiple air groups suggested to several staff officers that Third Fleet might be nearby. The plotted track showed that the pursuit had carried the center force east of Samar and away from the San Bernardino exit, with formations scattered and cruiser strength reduced by damage and scuttling, Kurita faced a trade-off: continue east with the units still in line and risk meeting heavier enemy carriers, or break contact, reform to the northwest, and attempt another approach later. At approximately 9:20 to 9:30, he chose to disengage and turn north, with orders disseminated incrementally as lookouts continued to report torpedo wakes and approaching aircraft. For Taffy 3, the immediate effect of the turn was reduced shellfire on the remaining carriers. It did not end losses. Samuel B. Roberts, having closed to within point-blank range earlier, was hit repeatedly and sank. Hole and Johnston, slowed and burning, went down with many of their crews. Kalinan Bay, White Plains, and St. Lo retained flight operations with damaged decks. Kitkoon Bay and Fanshawe Bay continued to zigzag under intermittent long-range fire. Surviving destroyer escorts corralled stragglers and laid smoke to cover the withdrawal of damaged units. Aircraft in the air redirected to attack retiring cruisers and to shadow battleships, relaying bearings to Taffy, 2, and to 7th Fleet headquarters. Beyond the immediate line of battle, the engagement created operational repercussions. 7th Fleet shifted additional patrols from Taffy, 1 and 2 into the northern sector, while shore-based aircraft at Tacloban reorganized sorties from scheduled ground support to maritime interdiction against retiring ships. 3rd Fleet air groups to the north continued strikes against Ozawa. The net effect across the theater was a temporary redistribution of air effort from Leyte ground support to sea control tasks, then a return to planned missions once the surface threat receded. Civilian and logistical effects became visible along the eastern Visayan coast within hours and days. Oil films from damaged ships drifted shoreward. Local navigators reported debris lines extending kilometers from the engagement area. Coastal traffic, already curtailed by Allied control measures, suspended operations east of Samar and Leyte until naval patrols declared routes clear of floating mines and unexploded ordnance. On Leyte, medical facilities at Tacloban and Dulag received increased naval casualties evacuated by small craft and patrol vessels, adding to the demands generated by the ground campaign. International and political reactions were muted at first due to the speed of events. In Washington, early communiques highlighted airstrikes against Japanese carriers in the north. Official summaries of the Samar action followed with delay as reports consolidated. In Tokyo, Shogo. One situation map showed the loss of the southern pincer and heavy attrition in the north. The center force disengagement was recorded as a temporary withdrawal for reorganization. Although staff memoranda acknowledged cruiser losses and the failure to reach Leyte Gulf. For both governments, the immediate priority remained operational, securing the Leyte beachhead on one side and preserving capital ships and fuel on the other. By late morning, the battle's escalation phase yielded a clear but costly outcome. The American escort carrier group retained enough combat capability to continue launching aircraft, despite the loss of Gambier Bay and heavy damage across multiple hulls. The Japanese center force, though still containing 4 battleships and several destroyers, had lost multiple heavy cruisers and cohesion. Ammunition and fuel constraints, uncertain reconnaissance, and the persistent presence of aircraft that could reappear every few minutes combined to convert numerical and caliber superiority into a diminishing return. The crisis passed not because either side ceased to resist, but because the conditions under which each commander could achieve his objective no longer existed. Kurita could not guarantee a breakthrough to Leyte Gulf with forces in hand, and Sprague could not continue a prolonged surface duel, but had extracted the time needed for survival and reinforcement. As Kurita's center force turned away from the burning eastern horizon, the battle entered a transitional phase between chaos and withdrawal. By mid-morning, the formations that had stormed through the San Bernardino Strait now scattered across a broad front extending north and west of Samar. Ships maneuvered independently, some still exchanging fire with distant American units, others pausing to rescue survivors or conduct damage control. Thick columns of smoke marked the positions of cruisers that had been hit by bombs or torpedoes. Communications between divisions remained intermittent, flag signals invisible through haze, wireless discipline still restrictive. Yamato, Kurita's flagship, maintained course northwest at reduced speed, while staff officers consolidated damage and ammunition reports. The decision to withdraw had not been formalized through a single order, but rather emerged through a sequence of implicit actions: battleships altering course to reform, cruisers breaking off individual attacks, and destroyers screening for possible submarine contact. The initial intent, to penetrate eastward and reach the invasion anchorage, had dissolved. Kurita's reasoning combined tactical, logistical, and psychological elements. Ammunition reports indicated that several heavy cruisers had expended most of their main batteries. Many ships had damaged fire control equipment or power failures. Visual and radio reports of multiple air attacks convinced staff that carrier air cover over Leyte remained intact. Moreover, the engagement's pattern, continuous uncoordinated harassment from small vessels and aircraft, suggested to him that major U.S. carrier forces could intervene at any moment. As the center force began to regroup, the destroyer Nawaki and others retrieved survivors from Chikuma and Chokai, then rejoined the main body. Each rescue slowed the formation's progress and risked aerial detection, but leaving crews adrift was unacceptable under service norms. The rescued sailors filled Yamato's and Nagato's decks, exhausted and oil-stained, bearing fragments of the battle's disarray. Reports transmitted to the combined fleet in Tokyo via relay stations indicated heavy damage to cruisers and continued enemy air pressure. Headquarters interpreted this cautiously. The official record framed the engagement as a difficult but valuable experience, masking the reality that the fleet was now in retreat. Overhead, American aircraft continued sporadic pursuit. Avengers from Taffy 3 and 2, joined by flights from Taffy 1, followed radar contacts of retreating ships westward. Low fuel and limited ordnance meant most sorties struck with 100 or 250-pound bombs, depth charges, or strafing runs. Even these minor attacks inflicted further damage. Suzuya, already weakened by near misses and internal fires, suffered explosions from ready-use torpedoes detonating amidships. Her crew abandoned ship by midday. Kumano and Toni escaped temporarily, but were later struck in subsequent days. Battleships Nagato and Haruna endured near misses that distorted plating and flooded compartments. On the American side, the withdrawal of the center force brought relief, but not complacency. Admiral Sprague maintained a defensive perimeter until mid-afternoon, expecting renewed attack or a second Japanese column. Rescue operations began immediately. Destroyer escorts and carrier aircraft located life rafts and debris fields from the sunken destroyers in Gambier Bay. Hundreds of sailors drifted for hours before recovery. Others would not be found. Communication with 7th Fleet restored full situational awareness only after midday, when reports from Taffy 2 and 1 confirmed the enemy's retreat north. At the same time, to the north, Task Force 38 continued its strikes on Ozawa's decoy carriers, ensuring that no major Japanese surface unit remained in offensive proximity to Leyte Gulf. The loss of the escort carrier St. Lo later that day introduced a new and ominous development. At approximately 10:50, a single Japanese aircraft, believed to be a Zero from a shore-based unit, dived directly into St. Lo's flight deck, detonating fuel and ordnance. The explosion destroyed the carrier within minutes. This marked one of the first organized kamikaze attacks of the war and signaled a new phase in Japanese aerial tactics: deliberate suicide missions against Allied naval forces. To the men of Taffy 3, it appeared as the final blow in a day of unbroken intensity. The sinking, though isolated, would soon be recognized as the prelude to systematic kamikaze operations from Luzon and Formosa in the months ahead. Kurita's force withdrew through the Sibuyan Sea on the night of the 25th to the 26th of October, reaching the anchorage at Brunei with 4 battleships, a handful of cruisers, and destroyers. Losses totaled 3 heavy cruisers sunk in the engagement, 1 later destroyed by air attack, and multiple others crippled. Damage control and casualty reports compiled en route showed several thousand killed or missing. The physical survival of Yamato and her sisters contrasted with the strategic outcome. Their firepower had not altered the course of operations on Leyte. The fleet's endurance, measured in remaining ammunition, fuel, and morale, was now finite. The human dimension of the battle surfaced as survivors recounted conditions aboard both Japanese and American ships. Japanese engineering crews fought internal fires in boiler rooms while compartments flooded. American sailors on escort carriers handled flight deck repairs under shell fire, manually jettisoning ammunition to prevent detonation. For both, the sensory environment, smoke, concussion, heat, erased distinctions between offensive and defensive action. The encounter became a study in endurance under asymmetrical circumstances. One side overmatched in tonnage but rich in initiative, the other overwhelming in ordnance yet constrained by doctrine and communication limits. By late October, the battle off Samar and the wider Leyte Gulf engagements had extinguished Japan's remaining prospects for coordinated fleet warfare. The Imperial Navy's loss of heavy cruisers and trained personnel was irreversible. Fuel reserves, already critical, could not support further large-scale sorties. Yamato and her consorts would spend most of the following months anchored at Kure and Tokuyama, their operational use restricted to last-resort scenarios. The shift in naval balance now favored total Allied sea control from the Marianas to the South China Sea. For the United States, the victory created both operational confidence and new caution. The actions of Taffy 3 demonstrated the defensive value of coordination, rapid improvisation, and air-sea integration, yet also exposed vulnerabilities. Isolated escort groups, divided command chains between 3rd and 7th fleets, and the risk of misallocated strength due to incomplete intelligence. Post-battle analyses at Pearl Harbor and Washington emphasized the need for clear unity of command in future operations. Lessons from Samar would influence fleet arrangements for the subsequent Luzon, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa campaigns. As the smoke cleared over the Philippine Sea, both sides confronted the end of an era. The Japanese fleet, once the symbol of imperial reach, had been reduced to a remnant. The U.S. Navy, though victorious, recognized that the Pacific War was entering its most destructive phase, one that would bring combat closer to Japan's home islands and introduce tactics of desperation unseen in earlier battles. The events off Samar thus served as both culmination and transition, the last full-scale surface action of the Pacific War and the opening signal of a new, more desperate mode of fighting. In the aftermath of the battle off Samar, both navies faced the immense task of reconstruction, of command coherence, morale, and operational doctrine. For Japan, the encounter represented the disintegration of its remaining strategic options at sea. The Imperial Navy, having committed nearly all available capital ships to Shogo 1, returned to port with its structure shattered. Kurita's battleships and a handful of escorts limped back to Brunei on the 26th of October, then onward to Kure and Sasebo. Fuel shortages forced ships to moor indefinitely, serving as floating batteries rather than active combatants. The loss of trained crews was even more severe. Thousands of gunners, fire control specialists, and engineers were dead or wounded. The operational culture that had once defined Japan's naval elite, offensive spirit, long-range torpedo tactics, and decisive battle doctrine, survived only in rhetoric. Inside the Naval General Staff, analysis of Shogo, one revealed a collision between tradition and reality. Some officers blamed inadequate coordination between fleet and air elements. Others cited intelligence failures and the untested concept of diverting U.S. forces through a decoy carrier group. The more fundamental problem, however, was fuel. The Philippine sea routes, now dominated by Allied air and submarine power, made deliveries from Borneo and Sumatra nearly impossible. Refineries at Balikpapan and Tarakan remained productive, but the tankers that carried their output were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Yamato's own sortie for Samar had consumed thousands of tons of fuel oil, nearly all that could be spared. Future operations of such scale were unsustainable. Morale within the fleet oscillated between fatalism and defiance. Survivors from Kurita's task force described exhaustion and disbelief at the result. A massive gun line, armed with the largest naval artillery ever built, had failed to overcome escort carriers. Yet the explanations reached beyond morale. The battle exposed the obsolescence of surface gunnery as the dominant form of naval warfare. Aircraft, not battleships, had decided the outcome. Within months, this recognition shaped the Navy's remaining strategy, what became known as the TOCO, Special Attack, Doctrine. Kamikaze tactics, first witnessed in the sinking of St. Lo, were systematized under the 1st Air Fleet, headquartered at Mabalacat, and later at Clark Field. Fuel and aircraft shortages meant that a single-use weapon, the pilot himself, became Japan's final resource. For the United States, Samar forced a different reckoning. The engagement demonstrated extraordinary individual performance, but also structural vulnerability. 7th Fleet's escort groups had been designed for convoy protection and amphibious support, not to face a battleship fleet. The coordination gap between Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet and Admiral Kincaid's 7th Fleet remained a subject of debate. Messages exchanged during October 24th to 25th revealed delayed transmission and ambiguous command responsibility for guarding the San Bernardino Strait. Admiral Nimitz's staff at Pearl Harbor later recommended procedural changes to prevent similar separation of carrier cover and amphibious protection. Operational success, in retrospect, owed as much to Japanese misjudgment as to American improvisation. Intelligence reassessment followed quickly. U.S. radio analysis units evaluated intercepted traffic from the retreating center force and concluded that Japan retained only a fraction of its major surface fleet. Reconnaissance confirmed the destruction of 4 carriers at Cape Engano, 2 battleships at Surigao Strait, and 3 heavy cruisers off Samar. In aggregate, the Imperial Navy had lost nearly half its remaining capital ships in 4 days. These findings prompted the Joint Chiefs of Staff to accelerate planning for operations against Luzon and Okinawa under the assurance that organized Japanese naval opposition could no longer disrupt amphibious staging areas. At the tactical level, Samar provided an unplanned laboratory for mixed force coordination. The cooperation between destroyers, carrier aircraft, and command ships revealed how small units could resist superior formations through agility and mutual support. Reports from destroyer captains emphasized smoke usage, independent torpedo employment, and continuous communication as critical to survival. Aviators noted that persistent harassment, even with light ordnance, produced effects disproportionate to weapon size by compelling enemy ships to maneuver and break formation. These observations became embedded in subsequent fleet training, particularly in escort carrier doctrines used during the Okinawa campaign. The human cost remained immediate and visible. Over 1,500 American sailors were killed in the Samar engagement. Hundreds more drifted in the water for up to 2 days before rescue. Many of the dead from Gambier Bay, Howell, and Johnston were never recovered. Survivors later described a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion, ordinary crews realizing they had faced the world's largest battleship and survived. Kurita's sailors experienced a parallel dissonance, crews who had fired the heaviest naval guns in existence returning to base with little to show but wrecked ships and depleted magazines. Memoirs and post-war interviews from both sides recorded respect rather than hatred, each recognizing in the other the endurance demanded by modern naval combat. Meanwhile, on Leyte, the consequences of the battle extended beyond the sea. The Japanese Army's garrisons, isolated by the loss of maritime supply, prepared for attritional defense. The Imperial Navy could no longer transport reinforcements in strength, forcing the Army to rely on small convoys and barges that faced constant air attack. The American advance inland met resistance but no longer faced the prospect of naval bombardment or evacuation interdiction. Airfields on Leyte became operational by early November, further tightening Allied control over the central Philippines. By December 1944, Yamato and her remaining consorts lay anchored at Kure and Tokuyama, their decks stripped of aircraft and ammunition. The ship's towering silhouettes, once symbols of Japanese naval power, now represented stagnation. Allied air reconnaissance frequently photographed them without opposition, confirming Japan's strategic paralysis. The Imperial Navy had ceased to exist as an offensive instrument. What remained was a symbolic fleet, preserved for a hypothetical final stand that no longer had strategic meaning. For the Allies, Samar and Leyte Gulf marked the final proof that the Pacific War had become a contest of production and logistics, not fleet engagements. U.S. industrial capacity replaced losses within weeks. Japan could no longer replace anything. Yet the battle also revealed a deeper shift, the disappearance of the old naval order. Battleships, whether American or Japanese, were relegated to bombardment and support roles. The dominance of carrier aviation was complete, and with it the requirement for continuous reconnaissance, integrated radar networks, and air-sea command unity that would define post-war naval architecture. The battle off Samar, therefore, was not merely the last great surface action, it was the demonstration of an irreversible transformation. In the smoke above Samar Island, the age of steel and gunnery yielded to the age of flight and electronic warfare. The fleets that had crossed paths that morning represented two epochs confronting each other. One built on decisive battle theory and artillery power, the other on mobility, sensors, and range. The encounter's outcome determined which would shape the remainder of the Pacific War and the future of naval warfare itself. The shift in momentum off Samar emerged not from a single blow, but from converging decisions between 8:20 and 9:30 on the 25th of October, 1944. At that interval, Center Force still retained 4 battleships: Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, Haruna, several heavy and light cruisers, and destroyers. Taffy, 3 fielded 6 escort carriers in varying states of damage, 2 surviving destroyers with torpedoes, and destroyer escorts short on ammunition. In material terms, the advantage remained with Vice Admiral Kurita, yet the geometry of the fight, the state of command and control, and the density of air attacks collectively moved the initiative away from the pursuing formation. The turning point consisted of 3 linked choices: American insistence on continuous flight operations under fire, destroyer-destroyer escort torpedo threats that forced repeated course changes, and Kurita's decision to disengage rather than continue east toward Leyte Gulf. American aircraft made the first element possible. Despite hits on Kalinin Bay and Gambier Bay's loss, Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Kitkun Bay, and St. Lo kept launching in short cycles. Wildcats and Avengers, many without ideal ordnance, imposed a tempo that prevented Japanese gunnery from stabilizing on the carriers for more than brief windows. Radar vectors from Taffy 3 and later from Taffy 2 guided pilots back on to withdrawing cruisers and the flanks of the battleships. Each regrouped strike, often fewer than a dozen aircraft, arrived often enough to reset Japanese fire control solutions and to compel destroyer screens to thicken, reducing the ability of cruisers to mass main battery fire. The practical effect was time. Decks stayed operational, new sorties formed, and damaged U.S. ships remained moving targets instead of stationary hulks. The second element was the persistent torpedo problem. Johnston's early run and Heermann's later approaches, joined by Samuel B. Roberts at close range, convinced multiple Japanese captains that long lance spreads might be inbound at any moment. Even unobserved tracks produced caution. Haruna and Kongo executed evasive turns during critical minutes. Kumano's bow damage removed a battery and slowed a division. Chokai and Chikuma absorbed cumulative hits and near misses that degraded propulsion and control. These outcomes fractured the column into packets of ships maneuvering on local judgment, widening intervals that Yamato's staff could not easily recompress through flag signals in smoke and squalls. Every independent turn consumed minutes and sea room, incrementally shifting the chase from a coordinated attack to a series of disconnected engagements. The third decisive element was Kurita's assessment on the flagship between roughly 900 and 920. Reports to the bridge were contradictory. Aerial sightings indicated numerous U.S. aircraft. Visual estimates of carrier silhouettes remained uncertain due to distance and smoke. Ammunition and damage returns from cruisers showed uneven capacity to continue. The plotted track line showed Center Force well east of San Bernardino, trending southeast of the original axis toward Leyte Gulf. To continue would require another hour of pursuit at high speed against targets that still launched aircraft, with the possibility, never disproven, that fast carriers and fast battleships lay beyond the weather front. To disengage would preserve battleships and destroyers for future operations, but concede the original objective of entering Leyte Gulf. Kurita chose to turn away to the north and northwest, disseminating the movement through voice and visual means as shells continued to land near the carriers. From the American perspective, this decision crystallized the momentum shift. Shellfire slackened on the carriers. Deck operations normalized from emergency cadence to routine cycles. Destroyer escorts consolidated a protective arc. Air groups diverted from Taffy. 1 and 2 increased pressure on retiring cruisers, finishing Chikuma and contributing to Suzuya's loss later in the day. The local tactical picture changed from survival under gunfire to interdiction of a withdrawing opponent. Yet the calculus remained narrow. Ammunition was low across the escorts. Fuel states in the air were marginal, and a renewed push by an intact battle line could have forced another crisis. The key difference was that such a push no longer occurred. Strategically, the turning point at Samar intersected with parallel decisions elsewhere that same morning. North of Luzon, Admiral Halsey had concentrated Third Fleet against Ozawa's decoy carriers. Messages regarding the availability of a fast battleship covering force for San Bernardino had been delayed or ambiguously interpreted. This meant that Taffy 3's fight was never shaped by the imminent arrival of heavy U.S. surface units. The shift in momentum, therefore, owed little to distant relief and almost entirely to local effects. Air harassment, torpedo threats, smoke, and command friction inside the pursuing force. Kurita's withdrawal did not result from a completed destruction of his ships, but from an appraisal that the probability of achieving the operational goal with forces on hand had fallen below acceptable risk. The decision also transformed the campaign's civilian and ground dimensions. With center force turning away, Leyte Gulf's anchorage remained viable for resupply. That afternoon, cargo operations resumed under intermittent air alerts rather than surface shelling. On Samar's coast, the acoustic horizon changed from continuous heavy-caliber detonations to scattered air attacks as retiring ships were pursued. Filipino coastal communities still faced hazards from debris and unexploded ordnance. But the prospect of a battleship bombardment of landing areas receded. For the U.S. Sixth Army, artillery ammunition and fuel deliveries stayed on schedule. For Japanese ground commands, expectations of naval gunfire support were replaced by orders to hold with existing stocks. Within the Imperial Navy, the turning moment produced immediate procedural consequences. Rescue operations for damaged cruisers began while still within reach of American aircraft, slowing reformation and increasing exposure. Damage control priorities shifted from preparing for another gunnery run to stabilizing propulsion, restoring steering, and reducing fires ahead of air attack. Signals to combined fleet framed the maneuver as a tactical regrouping, but unit logs recorded loss of formation, cohesion, and difficulties in re-establishing command nets. The fleet that had entered the Philippine waters in 3 coordinated axes was now a series of separated groups retiring on different bearings. The technical dimension of the turning point reflected a larger doctrinal transition. Radar-directed gunnery favored stable platforms and continuous tracking. Evasive maneuvers to counter torpedoes and bombs removed that stability. Optical directors required clear lines and known ranges. Smoke and rain erased both. Escort carriers, despite low speed and thin protection, exploited the one domain where they could dictate tempo, the air, and denied the surface fleet the steady conditions needed for maximal effect. The cumulative result was not the destruction of the battleship as a whole, but the erosion of the conditions under which battleships could decide an action. By early afternoon, the momentum shift was complete. Center force moved northwest through the Sibuyan Sea, frequently harassed by small strike groups. Taffy 3, though damaged and bereaved, retained 5 operating decks and enough aircraft to shadow and attack. Reports from Surigao Strait confirmed the southern pincer's loss. Radio intercepts from the north confirmed the decoy carrier's destruction. The operational pincer that Shogo 1 required no longer existed. The turning point at Samar thus connected a local tactical decision to theater-level outcomes. The beachhead remained supplied, the Imperial Navy's last bid to disrupt the Leyte operation failed, and the balance of initiative in the Central Philippines passed irreversibly to Allied commanders. In post-action analyses on both sides, the moment of Kurita's turn became the focal entry in war diaries and staff studies. American submarines emphasized persistent air action and torpedo attacks. Japanese submarines emphasized uncertainty about enemy main forces and the degradation of cruiser strength. Both agreed on the mechanism. A numerically superior surface force lost the initiative when its commanders could neither maintain formation nor guarantee immunity from continuous air attack. The consequence extended beyond that morning. With fuel diminished, cruisers lost, and air cover absent, the Imperial Navy no longer possessed a method to regain momentum in open waters. Combat operations off Samar ended by increments rather than a single ceasefire. Between 9:30 and noon on 25 October 1944, Kurita's center force, 4 battleships, several cruisers, and destroyers turned north and northwest, reducing speed and breaking radar contact with Taffy 3's escorts and aircraft. By evening, surviving Japanese units transited back through the Sibuyan Sea toward the South China Sea. Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna crossed the same waters where Musashi had been lost the previous day. Escorting destroyers conducted rescue work for crews of Chikuma and Chokai before rejoining the main body. South of Leyte, the southern force had already ceased to exist after Surigao Strait. To the north, Ozawa's decoy carriers were under continuous strike at Cape Engano. The multi-axis operation that had aimed to converge inside Leyte Gulf no longer had a functioning southern or northern arm. Withdrawal produced immediate logistical and medical requirements. On Japanese decks, rescued sailors were issued dry clothing and ration rice. Burn cases were triaged in wardrooms using morphine and sulfa powders. Damage control teams shored bulkheads, rigged emergency steering, and cleared flooded magazines. Ammunition inventories taken aboard battleships showed reduced secondary battery rounds and expended star shells. Several cruisers reported near exhaustion of main battery ammunition. Fuel states were recorded for the return leg to Brunei, with planned refueling by limited tankers. Messages to combined fleet on 25th to 26th October summarized losses and requested hospital berths at Cure. Survivors from cruisers gathered for nominal rolls. Many names were recorded as missing until later confirmed by wreck positions or captured documents. American units transitioned from fighting to rescue and reconstitution. Taffy 3's remaining carriers, Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkoon Bay, and St. Lo, prior to her loss, maintained air patrols while destroyer escorts swept rafts and oil patches for survivors. Rescue operations continued into the night and through the 26th of October, with small craft towing clusters of men to ships with medical facilities. Naval chaplains conducted burial at sea for bodies recovered aboard. Identification tags, service numbers, and next-of-kin data were logged for later notification. 7th Fleet redistributed anti-submarine patrols to re-establish a defensive screen on the eastern approaches while ground support sorties for 6th Army resumed on adjusted schedules. Air and submarine pursuit affected the withdrawing Japanese formations. On 25th to 26th October, Avengers and Helldivers from Taffy Groups and Task Force 38 shadowed damaged cruisers. Suzuya suffered internal explosions and sank. Kumano, with her bow blown off earlier, escaped temporarily, but would be sunk later off Luzon. Tone and Haguro withdrew with damage for repair in home waters. The destroyer Nawaki, which had picked up survivors from Chikuma, was intercepted on the night of 26 October by U.S. cruisers and sunk with nearly all hands, eliminating many of the rescued personnel. Kurita's battleships reached Brunei on the 26th of October and then returned to Japanese home waters in early November as tanker support in the South China Sea. Sea deteriorated under submarine attack. Casualty figures reflect the multi-battle character of Leyte Gulf. Across 23rd to 26th October, Japanese losses included 4 carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chaitos, Chiyoda, 3 battleships, Musashi in the Sibuyan Sea, Fuso and Yamashiro at Surigao, 10 cruisers and light cruisers sunk or scuttled, and over a dozen destroyers with personnel losses on the order of 10,000 to 12,500. American losses across the same period included 1 light carrier, Princeton at Luzon on October 24th, 1 escort carrier at Samar from air attack later in the day, St. Lo. 2 escort carriers lost across the operation in total, 2 destroyers and 1 destroyer, escort off Samar, and several damaged units, with personnel losses around 2,800 to 3,100. Within the Samar sector alone, Japanese losses were concentrated in heavy cruisers. American losses centered on Gambier Bay, Howell, Johnston, Samuel B. Roberts, and St. Lo. The sinking of St. Lo at approximately 10:50 on 25 October by a deliberate suicide dive marked a doctrinal inflection. Within hours, U.S. after-action reports noted the aircraft's direct impact, explosion sequence, and magazine detonation. 7th Fleet issued cautionary guidance on combat air patrol altitudes and warning times for low-level approaches. Japanese air commands on Luzon and Formosa formalized TOCO procedures during the following days, assigning mixed units of Zero and other types to attack carriers at anchorages and underway. The Samar incident thus linked the closing phase of surface combat to a new aerial threat that would define later Philippine and Okinawa operations. Civilian consequences unfolded along Samar and Leyte coasts. Oil slicks and floating wreckage drifted toward the eastern littorals. Coastal patrols marked no-go zones for fishing, while explosive ordnance disposal teams neutralized depth charges and stray mines washed ashore. In Tacloban, where Commonwealth civil authorities had been restored on October 20th, hospitals received naval casualties alongside Army wounded from inland fighting. Supply ships resumed unloading ammunition, rations, and engineering stores in Leyte Gulf, once reports confirmed the center force's withdrawal. Inter-island traffic remained limited by air alerts, but the absence of a surface bombardment allowed landing schedules to normalize by 26th to 27th October. On the Japanese side, the withdrawal set in motion administrative and strategic changes. Combined fleet directed surviving heavy units to conserve fuel by remaining in home waters. Repair priorities at Kure and Sasebo allocated scarce dry dock time to battleships and the least damaged cruisers. Ships beyond economical repair were decommissioned for parts and gun transfers to coastal defense. Personnel bureaus consolidated lists of missing and dead from Samar, Surigao, and Cape Engano. Family notifications began in November, using standard forms that recorded location and unit without detailed circumstances. Operational planning staff acknowledged that further attempts at large-scale sorties were not feasible without tanker protection. This conclusion informed the later decision to reserve Yamato and other units for homeland defense, culminating months later in the limited sortie toward Okinawa. U.S. command arrangements adjusted in the immediate aftermath. After-action conferences between 7th Fleet and 3rd Fleet staffs reviewed message traffic, timing of Halsey's movement north, and the absence of a designated fast battleship group at San Bernardino. Procedural changes recommended clearer language for queries and the explicit assignment of covering forces for straits when amphibious operations were underway. Escort carrier doctrine incorporated lessons on emergency launch cycles, smoke coordination with surface escorts, and employment of light ordnance against large ships to produce maneuver effects rather than armor penetration. The maritime environment of the Central Philippines reflected the battle's scale. Hydrographic units updated charts with new wreck positions to warn navigators. Salvage priorities focused on clearing approaches to Leyte Gulf anchorages and marking hazards for LST and Liberty ship traffic. Allied divers recovered code materials and navigational equipment from accessible wrecks where feasible. Japanese scuttling and the depth of many losses limited such efforts. Weather during the last week of October moderated, allowing uninterrupted convoys to enter the Gulf with artillery ammunition and fuel that sustained the ground offensive toward Carigara Bay. For participants on both sides, withdrawal did not conclude the personal consequences. Survivors from Johnston, Howell, Gambier Bay, and Samuel B. Roberts spent hours to days in rafts before recovery. Some died from exposure, wounds, or shark attack before rescue. Japanese survivors brought to shore in Japan entered hospitals at Kure, Sasebo, and Hiroshima prefecture facilities. Those captured at sea were processed through prisoner-of-war camps in the rear areas of the Pacific or in Australia. War diaries written in late October and November recorded routine tasks, inventory, repair, watch bills, set against an awareness that the fleet's offensive role had ended. By the close of October 1944, the operational picture in the central Philippines had stabilized in favor of the Allied advance. The center force had withdrawn. The southern force was destroyed. The northern force's carriers were gone. The amphibious beachhead at Leyte remained supplied and expanded under air cover from both escort carriers and newly opened airstrips. The immediate humanitarian burdens, medical treatment, recovery of dead, and civilian safety along mined and polluted coasts continued into November. The battle off Samar thus moved from combat to consequence, a transition marked by repatriation and repair on one side, consolidation and forward movement on the other, and a naval balance that no longer permitted Japan to contest sea lines to the Philippines. The battle off Samar concluded as the defining microcosm of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf, an encounter in which the Imperial Japanese Navy's remaining strength met the limits of its doctrine, logistics, and technology. In retrospect, the engagement compressed within a few hours the transformation of naval warfare that had been unfolding since 1942, from surface gunnery duels and night torpedo attacks to air-sea integration and continuous surveillance. By 26 October 1944, the waters east of Samar and throughout the Philippine archipelago were filled with the remnants of four simultaneous actions: the Sibuyan Sea, Surigao Strait, Cape Engano, and Samar, each ending in isolation, each revealing a fragment of the same outcome: the irreversible collapse of Japan's capacity to fight at sea. In strategic terms, Leyte Gulf was the last fleet engagement in which Japan attempted to decide a campaign by concentrated surface power. The combined operation had mobilized nearly every major ship still afloat: 4 aircraft carriers, 9 battleships, 19 cruisers, and more than 30 destroyers. Less than half would survive intact. The surviving battleships, including Yamato and Nagato, withdrew to home waters where fuel shortages confined them to defensive readiness. Congo was sunk weeks later by an American submarine while returning to Japan. Haruna would be destroyed by air attack at Kure in 1945. The loss of 10 heavy cruisers and hundreds of veteran officers permanently crippled the command structure that had guided the Imperial Navy since the 1930s. For Japan, the consequences were not limited to ships. They extended to the entire strategic system built upon seaborne access to the southern resources that sustained the empire. Once the Philippines fell, the oil lifeline from the Netherlands East Indies was effectively severed. For the United States and its allies, the outcome confirmed the ascendance of carrier aviation and radar-directed coordination. Escort carriers, initially designed for convoy protection, had demonstrated operational resilience under direct surface fire, proving that distributed air power could offset tonnage disadvantage. The defense of Taffy, 3 reshaped tactical doctrine, the integration of air, surface, and radar assets into mutually supporting roles. In post-war analyses by the Bureau of Ships and the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Samar action became a model of distributed resistance, cited alongside Midway as evidence that flexibility could neutralize numerical inferiority. Future naval design, from carrier group formations to anti-air and anti-submarine warfare doctrine, absorbed lessons drawn from those few hours east of Samar. The human dimension remained as significant as the technical. Survivors of both navies described the encounter as disorienting, not heroic. Japanese officers later recalled the disbelief of seeing light escort carriers turn repeatedly into the wind to launch aircraft amid shell splashes. American destroyer crews, outgunned by calibers exceeding 18 inches, reported alternating between disciplined firing drills and the raw instinct of survival. The mutual recognition of professional competence, rare amid wartime propaganda, appeared in post-war memoirs. Both sides acknowledged that courage alone could neither restore fuel to tanks nor rebuild shattered formations. The outcome was determined by systemic endurance, not momentary valor. At the strategic level, Leyte Gulf sealed the fate of Japan's maritime empire. Within 3 months, Allied operations extended northward. The Mindoro landings in December 1944, the invasion of Luzon in January 1945, and the approach to Okinawa by spring. With the Philippine archipelago under Allied control, Japan's communications with the Netherlands East Indies collapsed. Tankers that had once carried Borneo, crewed to Tokuyama and Sasebo, were sunk in the South China Sea. The remaining heavy ships of the combined fleet were effectively immobilized. When Yamato was ordered on her final sortie in April 1945 under Operation Tengo, it was a symbolic gesture, a one-way voyage conceived as sacrifice rather than strategy, an echo of the failed breakthrough toward Leyte Gulf. Politically and culturally, the battle's memory diverged sharply across nations. In Japan, official recognition of Leyte Gulf's scale was muted during the final months of the war. Post-war accounts by surviving admirals focused on the tactical confusion, communications breakdowns, and the loss of trained personnel, rather than moral failure. In the United States, Samar entered naval historiography as an exemplar of improvisation under fire. The phrase, "the little ships that fought like battleships," became shorthand for courage under impossible conditions, though later scholarship emphasized the structural and doctrinal context that made their survival possible. By the late 20th century, joint U.S.-Japanese research based on recovered records reconstructed the engagement in technical detail, replacing earlier mythologized accounts with a more balanced picture of command decision-making, damage effects, and logistics. Environmental and archaeological traces of the battle persist beneath the Philippine Sea. Surveys using deep-sea sonar in the 21st century located the wrecks of Johnston, Gambier Bay, Chokai, and others resting at depths exceeding 6,000 meters. These sites, remarkably preserved by pressure and darkness, serve as silent archives of the engagement's violence. Shattered turrets, twisted propeller shafts, and steel plates bearing the marks of shells that crossed kilometers of ocean in seconds. Maritime historians now treat these wrecks as both memorials and data sources, enabling measurement of battle damage and reconstruction of trajectories that once existed only in logbooks. From a broader historical perspective, the battle off Samar was less an isolated clash than the symbolic closure of a naval era. It completed a transformation begun at Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, and tested to conclusion at Midway. The displacement of decisive surface battle by long-range strike warfare. It exposed the exhaustion of Japan's industrial base and the fragility of war plans detached from economic capacity. It also demonstrated the accelerating interdependence of technology, intelligence, and logistics that would define modern military systems. By 1945, these lessons shaped not only fleet composition, but strategic thinking itself, anticipating the Cold War's emphasis on deterrence, sensors, and endurance over direct confrontation. The legacy of Samar endures in professional study more than in popular imagery. For naval officers, it remains a case study in command under uncertainty. How limited forces, unified by information and initiative, can impose disproportionate effects on a stronger enemy, and how, conversely, a powerful formation can lose initiative through fragmentation and miscommunication. For historians, it stands as evidence that even in industrial war, outcomes are decided not only by production scales, but by perception, adaptability, and the cumulative weight of countless human decisions made in minutes. When the smoke cleared and the ships withdrew, the sea east of Samar returned to silence, its surface unmarked save for oil slicks and drifting debris. Beneath that calm lay the remains of men and machines from both sides, intertwined within the same expanse of ocean that had witnessed the twilight of one naval age and the dawn of another. The battle's true legacy was not triumph or defeat, but transformation, the moment when the gun and the battleship yielded irrevocably to the aircraft and the horizonless reach of air power, signaling the final turn of the Pacific War and the end of Japan's era as a maritime empire.